Today, we view the history of slavery in terms of its horrific human impact, but in the 18th and 19th century, financial considerations dominated the interests of those involved in the slave trade. Slaves were seen as property, and their experience as human beings was not considered. To understand the extent to which Britain has been shaped by the slave trade, it is important to consider the scale and the breadth of slavery's impact on the British economy. The British economy was transformed by the Atlantic slave trade. In 1700, 80% of British trade went to Europe from ports on the east or south coasts. But by 1800, 60% of British trade went to Africa and America, sailing from three main west coast ports: Glasgow, Liverpool, and Bristol. Ports such as London, Bristol, and Liverpool prospered as a direct result of involvement in the slave trade. Other ports, such as Glasgow in Scotland, profited from the tobacco trade. Thousands of jobs were created in Britain supplying goods and services to slave traders. In a period which saw Britain industrialize, profits could be made by exporting manufactured British goods to Africa, and then further profits accrued from imported slave products such as sugar, which became very fashionable with the British people. The slave trade was important in the development of the wider economy. Financial, commercial, legal, and insurance institutions all emerged to support the activities of the slave trade. Some merchants became bankers, and many new businesses were financed by the profits made from slave trading. The slave trade played an important role in providing British industry with access to raw materials. This contributed to the increased production of manufactured goods. The image you see now on your screen shows the parts of Britain's economy that benefited from the slave trade: shipping and ports, exports and manufacturing, the Industrial Revolution, London and finance, and wealth and income. In 1700, 80% of British trade went to Europe from ports on the east and south coasts. By 1800, 60% of British trade went to Africa and America, often sailing from three main west coast ports of Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow. British exports in 1800 were 4 times higher than in 1700. But were these changes due to the slave trade? The Atlantic ports grew in part because so many of the slave ships sailed from these ports, but they grew as much from their general involvement with the Atlantic economy as from trading in slaves. This provokes a what-if question. What if there had been no enslaved Africans in the Caribbean? Well, it is safe to guess that the trade would have still taken place. Trade regulations made sure that exports to the colonies came from Britain. But without the Atlantic slave trade, it would have taken many, many years for a workforce to be established in the colonies. The growth of exports to the colonies would have been much, much slower. The slave trade was important in providing British industries with raw materials. These were turned into manufactured goods in Britain and then sold for large profits in Europe and in the colonies. Plantation-grown goods such as rum, tobacco, coffee, sugar, and cotton were bought from the profits of selling African slaves to the plantation owners and sold for a profit in Britain and Europe. The most obvious and dramatic effects of the Atlantic slave trade were changes to the Atlantic coast ports of Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow. In 1700, Liverpool and Bristol were small towns. Glasgow's population was around 12,000. This figure quadrupled in 100 years. These three ports had become important cities by 1800, largely as a result of trade in slaves or plantation-grown products. Liverpool grew wealthy from plantation-grown cotton. Bristol's wealth was partly based on slave-produced sugar, and Glasgow became the UK's main tobacco port. The shipping industry grew enormously. Most of the British slave ships were fitted in these ports. There was as much work involved in building, fitting, and repairing the ships as in sailing them. Liverpool became a major shipbuilding city as a result of the slave trade. Trade with the Caribbean employed half of Britain's long-distance ships. Many ship owners involved in the slave trade were also plantation owners. Often profits were spent by merchants around the ports. The impact of the profits. Many plantation owners, especially in Scotland, built large town or country houses. Some endowed schools and other public buildings with money from plantation slavery. For example, in Bristol, the merchant Edward Colston, who made huge profits from the triangular trade, donated an estimated £100,000 to the city, including the foundation of a boys' school named after him. Let's now take a look at the wealth of ports and merchants. In Bristol, In the early 18th century, Bristol dominated the British end of the slave trade. Bristol merchants established strong trade links with West Africa. The boom for Bristol was created through this slave trading success. Industries such as sugar refining grew as a result of the slave trade. Liverpool also grew into a powerful city, directly through shipping of slaves. By the end of the 18th century, Liverpool controlled over 60% of the entire British slave trade. Liverpool's cotton and linen mills and other subsidiary industries, such as rope making, created thousands of jobs supplying goods to slave traders. By the 1780s, Liverpool had become the largest slave ship building site in Britain. Other ports, such as Glasgow, profited from the slave trade. In Glasgow, the tobacco trade contributed hugely to the profits and development of the city. The tobacco lords, as the merchants of Glasgow became known, made a lot of money dealing in tobacco, not slaves. London was already trading in African slaves before 1700. It continued to be Britain's main port for the slave ships, but merchants found other ways of making money. The Atlantic trade, including slave trade, provided the impetus to develop merchant banking. So what was merchant banking? Merchants made their money from buying goods at low prices and selling them at high prices. But they didn't receive this profit until after the voyage and after the goods had been sold. A voyage could take 6 months or longer. In the meantime, merchants had to finance the voyage, paying for the ship and sailors. They also carried the risk that if the ship might be lost at sea, it was also up to the merchant to find outlets to sell the goods. Specialist skills developed around each part of the process of trading. Financial, commercial, legal, and insurance institutions emerged to support the activities of slave traders. As examples, David and Alexander Barclay set up Barclays Bank. Sir Francis Baring started Baring's Bank. London became the centre for marine insurance. Lloyd's of London, founded in 1688, is still the world's leading insurance marketplace. Atlantic slave trade profits also went to anyone who was wealthy enough to buy shares in the newly invented joint stock companies. The South Sea Trading Company was set up in 1711, and it invested in the slave trade and in plantations. Its shares were very popular and rose rapidly in value. It is debatable how much the wealth created contributed to the British economy. The slave trade offered an opportunity to get rich quick, and many traders grew wealthy from its profits. But it was also a risky business with many investors making losses. Some merchants used their wealth to invest in British industries, banks, and in new businesses. But other merchants and plantation owners invested elsewhere. Much of the profits of slavery was spent on individual acquisition. For example, merchants bought landed estates or had large townhouses built as status symbols. As regards funding the Industrial Revolution, profits from slavery roughly equated to the amount invested in new industries. Profits from the Atlantic economy were a recognizable contribution to the total profits of British businessmen. But it cannot be said that without these particular funds, investment in the Industrial Revolution would not have taken place. So, was Britain economically better off as a result of the slave trade? Those that argue yes point to houses, buildings, and parks financed by the slave trade, and to the building of the empire. Those that argue no on the basis that only a narrow group of people profited from the slave trade. They claim that the estimates of those who support the yes argument are exaggerated. They also point to the large costs of building and running an empire, which includes fighting wars related to its expansion and defense. These were paid for in part by the taxpayer.